these teachings have come from somewhere else. They're not mine. And all I'm doing is kind of sharing them with you. And it's a really lovely feeling, actually. Because it's not like, made these up. Like this was part of a really big part of my life for many, many years. Hi, my name's Andy, and welcome to Headspace. No, not really. Actually, if you use the app, you're probably not used to seeing me because they keep me locked in a very dark studio. After 7 years, they let me out. And the more I thought about how I wanted to spend my time, the more I thought about how nice it would be to maybe go on a bit of a journey together. The techniques of meditation are just one small part of how to live a healthier and happier life. I feel I can share it in a very different way out here than I can when I'm sitting in the studio. And that's it, really. So, shall we go? So I'm sitting on top of a mountain in Death Valley, and over the last couple of days, traveling through the valley, been reminded a lot of just how long these places take to create. Yesterday we were at a volcano. It was like 2,000 years old. And sitting by that volcano, it struck me that the exercises that we use at Headspace, all the teachings actually, are actually older than that volcano. They're older than 2,000 years. They go back maybe more than 2,500 years. And we get so many questions in at Headspace asking kind of, where did Andy do his training? And, where do the techniques come from? What the teaching's based on? And I think it's really important. It's a great question. And it's really important. Because it's not like, made these up. Like this was part of a really big part of my life for many, many years. And being a monk and being part of that lineage and that tradition, and still now being in touch with those same teachers, means that it's kind of kept it alive. So I think it's quite a rare thing, actually, to be part of a tradition that has been around for such a long period of time. And the way I've always thought about it is that, okay, so if you could devote 2,500 years, 3,000 years, however long, to a particular thing, my guess is that over that period of time, it would become pretty refined. So really, like, if you think about it as a period of sort of R&D, in which a technique can evolve, in which a teaching can adapt and can change. I feel like we're not at the end of that journey yet, but where we are on that journey, we can feel pretty confident that the teachings that we're sort of receiving, are based on a lot of experience. And that, for me, is the most important thing, that it's based on experience. It's not an idea, it's not a concept, a philosophy. This is based on experience of many people sitting over many years. We might go into a retreat for a weekend or something and think, wow, it's amazing. And then you think, okay, so what does that look like over several thousands of years of people sitting day after day, kind of evolving these techniques? So my hope is that in having a better understanding of that lineage and that tradition, that it gives you a greater sense of confidence. Sure, there's all the science now that kind of shows us how it works, maybe why it works. But for me, the exciting thing is really where it comes from and how it feels right now in this moment. And it's interesting, I've trained in a few different traditions, first in the Burmese tradition and then in the Tibetan tradition. And the particular tradition in which I trained in the Tibetan school, it's often sort of called the oral tradition. And the idea is that every single teaching is passed down from teacher to student in person. So you can't even practice the teaching. You can't learn it from a book and then just practice it. In order to even get the instructions and the materials you need to practice it, you have to go and sit with a teacher and have that exchange. So that's a really sort of powerful thing. And it's something that definitely drew me towards that path when I was growing up, and it's something that sustained me as a monk as I was training, and now in teaching, it gives me a great confidence that I'm not. It's a strange feeling, actually. It's one of sort of, I want to say no pressure. It's these teachings have come from somewhere else. They're not mine, and all I'm doing is kind of sharing them with you, and it's a really lovely feeling, actually, because the confidence comes from knowing I trained with really, really wise teachers, and that it stretches back thousands of years. And my role is simply just to be a friendly sort of friend along the way, and to share those with you and help hopefully navigate the journey. So, as I said, I'd love you to think of that when you sit down and meditate. Just to remember kind of that is part of this journey. Because I really think over time that lends itself to feeling, as I say, more confident, a greater sense of trust. And even on those days when it might be challenging, somehow you know you're part of something kind of bigger, and it's okay that it's challenging. At least that's the way that I've always related to it. It's funny, one of the things I quite enjoy, actually. There's a tension, right? A lot of people will say, but these days it's meditation, it's on your phone, kind of, is it really as close to the practice and the teachings as it existed thousands of years ago? And I like that tension personally. I think it represents an evolution of delivery. It doesn't in any way negate that tradition, that lineage. Doesn't in any way dilute it. In fact, I think the essence is still alive. As long as we're still practicing, and as long as that lineage remains unbroken, then the essence is still alive. It's simply the delivery that's changed. But it is a big shift, there's no doubt. But then it's always changed and evolved, If I think back to the beginning of this tradition, my own training happened to be in sort of the Buddhist tradition. That was a long time ago. I was in India, and as it went into other countries, it changed into other languages, and it met other cultures where they were. And it had to adapt. It had to adapt to the environment. It had to adapt to the culture and the traditions that were already in place. If I think of Tibet, when Buddhism arrived in Tibet and these meditation techniques arrived in Tibet, it was meeting a landlocked sort of country and people that hadn't really gone outside of that area. And a tradition, it was known as Bon at the time, and really it was like a fusing, it was a coming together of these different traditions. And I think the beauty of meditation is that because meditation transcends, sure, there are teachings around it, there's culture around it, but because the meditation transcends any particular faith, religion, culture, it's able to adapt in this way. And as it's come to the West, now we find ourselves using it on our phones. Again, the delivery might be different, the language might be different, but the essence is fundamentally the same. If I think about my own sort of personal journey, when I'd love to kind of paint you a picture of just a really clean, easy journey. I went away, I became a monk. I lived there for 10 years. That was the end of it. I came home, and kind of not really like that. It's very rarely sort of like that. I went away and I really wanted to be a monk, I thought I'd be a monk for life, actually. And I thought I was going to be a Tibetan monk. And look, this was way before the internet. The only thing I had to go on was The Lonely Planet and a few meditation books at home. So I just booked myself a flight to India. I knew the Dalai Lama lived there. I thought, that's a good place to start. And I remember kind of going there and finding the whole thing just so overwhelming. It was almost like it was too busy. My mind was already sort of busy. And I think it wasn't that the tradition was busy. My mind was so busy that it felt very busy. So I ended up kind of finding my way sort of towards the Burmese tradition and lineage. And it's very simple in many ways. People often ask me, well, did the people sort of speak English there? Actually, I didn't speak a lot of English. It was pretty much go over there and sit down and just keep doing that. Come and see me sort of for 10 minutes a day. You go and see the teacher for 10 minutes a day. He couldn't really speak any English. I couldn't speak any Burmese. So we just sort of sat looking at each other, sort of smiling, occasionally crying, that sort of thing. And there was something really beautiful about the simplicity of that. And over time, I did learn a little bit of a language. And there was an interpreter who came in and kind of helped me explain or helped me understand sort of the foundations of the teachings. And those foundations are really, really important. It's really easy to kind of skip over them and, let's get to the visualization or let's get to sort of the more complicated techniques. But I remember my teacher saying at the time, until we can really get to a point where we're comfortable just focusing on the breath, all the other techniques, maybe they don't matter sort of too much. So on that journey, I felt I got to a place where definitely my awareness had kind of become a bit more stable, and I was starting to enjoy the journey. But there was still sort of something kind of missing, and for me that was a warmth, it was a lightness, it was a playfulness, it was just a sense of, I don't know whether I describe it as joy or love or compassion. There's a lot of different kind of words in there, I know, but there was something kind of that I felt I just hadn't sort of unlocked or uncovered or discovered within my own mind. And I met a Tibetan Lama, and it's extraordinary. I remember sitting there in front of him, and I just welled up, actually. I was just really overwhelmed by, he didn't say anything. I was just overwhelmed by his presence, his sense of warmth and comfort. I think I'd never felt quite as accepted as I am by anybody in my life, maybe my parents, but as a parent now, I could say it's a bit more complicated relationship. I think with him, I just felt immediately sort of welcomed, and in talking to him, I made the decision to become a monk in the Tibetan tradition, and I went to India and I became a monk out there, and did a lot of retreat and some teaching, and and the rest is kind of history. Well, it's another story for another time, I think. But through that journey, the thing that really fascinated me was the journey that those people had been on, that those teachers had been on, and how they'd got to that point. So that first Tibetan Lama I met in Scotland, and you think, what's a Tibetan Buddhist Lama doing in Scotland? More than that, he was in a monastery, a Buddhist monastery in Scotland, and about 40, 50 years ago, the Scottish government had given the Tibetan people, as they came out of Tibet, a piece of land, and they built a monastery there. And in learning more about their journey, it was incredibly humbling. So they would tell us kind of the stories that of not what only they'd gone through themselves, but sort of previous generations had done as well. Learning about these teachers who would go from Tibet to India to get these teachings. And then they travel back with them. And you kind of think, these days, well, sure, yeah, you hop on a flight and you go over there and you get them and you come back. Like, this is with a donkey, like going over the Himalayas and having to carry multiple kind of manuscripts back and then putting them into a printing press and sharing them. It's a really time-consuming thing. So some of these teachers would make that journey kind of multiple times in their lifetime. And then if you fast forward, and you're able to kind of trace sort of each teacher through the ages, and then you get to sort of a more modern sort of day history, and back in the late 50s, early 60s, where Tibet is in a really sort of challenging place. A lot of people are fleeing Tibet, and because of the sort of political troubles that were going on there. And I remember my teacher one day sharing the story of how he and his brother and some other very senior teachers had left with many, many kind of people, hundreds of people. And they'd begun the journey of trying to escape from Tibet over the Himalayas in the middle of winter. Not only do they have to survive the cold, Not only did they have to survive very little food, they also had to try not to be shot by the Chinese soldiers that were in the Himalayas at the time. And they were having to try and make it to India or Nepal. And, you know, I think they've had to tell that story many times. But when they tell it with a real sort of vulnerability, it's impossible to imagine, you know, kind of making that journey, spending 6 months in the Himalayas. Many like a lot of them died on that journey. I think maybe 11 or 12 kind of made it. And the stories they tell, like along the way, of running out of food, to the point where they're having to take off their leather shoes and boil them in water and then drink the broth as their only sort of form of nutrition. And I think when you understand the lengths that people went to, and it's really important to say, of course they were looking for their own personal freedom, but they were genuinely trying to get these teachings out of Tibet. Most of the teachings were destroyed. A lot of the monasteries were destroyed. A lot of the books were destroyed. They were trying to take these teachings in physical form, but also in their head and their learning out of Tibet to ensure that it survived. And I think when you understand the journey, the lengths that they went to do that, all of a sudden, not only is it very kind of humbling, but also there's just a different kind of appreciation for what it is you do each time you sit down and meditate. That people have made that journey, that some people have given up their lives in order that we kind of have this now. And it can sound, you know, not grand, but it can sound sort of a bit big sometimes, that as an idea. But on a very personal level, I've found that if I sit with an appreciation of that, my meditation is completely different. Because then it's not just about time, a length of time, stretching back into the distance. It becomes very personal. There were people involved in kind of making that journey. And every single person has contributed something. And in sitting down and in practicing your meditation, you in turn are contributing something to that journey. And so it's continued kind of evolution. So however you kind of look at this journey and this tradition, as I say, my hope is that you can get a sense of this being a really precious thing, you know. Something that I think is really rare in the world. It's really unusual to have the opportunity to practice something which has been so well looked after, so cared for such a long period of time. And I hope that on these journeys, eventually, we might even be able to kind of go over there and I can introduce you to some of those teachers and show you some of those places.